edition of World Crisis Radio. This is your host and commentator, Webster Tarpley, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, August 31st, 2018. And we're here on the banks of the Potomac. It's another one of these sunny but hazy afternoons with high humidity. We were, of course, hoping for big indictments today. We were looking for big indictments, and when we saw that Chuck Todd of NBC News yesterday evening had put out a notice, I guess, a call saying don't go on vacation on Friday, right? Don't stay home from work. Don't miss work tomorrow, said Chuck Todd at about 6 or 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, because something big, Mueller bombshell was awaited. Well, I don't know if we have a bombshell, but at least we've got one indictment, and you can't, that ain't hay. So this is now a certain Samuel Patton, Patton. He is an associate of Manafort and of Kilimnik. And I guess this completes the encirclement of Manafort and Kilimnik. This character, Patton, is indicted not directly by Mueller and company, but rather by the normal District of Columbia U.S. Attorney's Office, as I read this anyway, but certainly not by Manafort, not by Mueller. And that's going to be another interesting front. Who is Patton? Well, 20 years ago, he worked for that wonderful liberal Republican, Susan Collins of Maine. And, of course, the wonderful is in sarcastic print. And he then went on to work in the State Department under Bush the Younger, George W. Bush. So he is something of a Republican wheelhorse, but maybe a liberal Republican wheelhorse. But that makes no difference. He was supposed to register as a foreign agent under FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. He failed to do so, and therefore he has been indicted. And, of course, all these things are strategic. They go up the ladder. So that at least has set the stage. Now, I don't want anybody out there despairing, right? We were looking forward to today, Friday, the 31st of August, right, hoping that this might be the occasion for something big. And instead we've gotten this Patton indictment, right? As long as it's an indictment, you really can't complain. But you also got to remember the informal Department of Justice guideline refers, I think, primarily to people who are themselves candidates. So you're not supposed to come out and indict, say, a candidate for Congress or Senate in the 60 days before that person is going to be on the ballot in an election. Now, for the vast majority of the likely targets of the current Russiagate, Trumpgate investigation, they're not on the ballot. Trump is not on the ballot, nor are many of these others. So it is not clear at all whether this 60-day rule actually applies. But in any case, 60 days, we have to remember what this means. The coming November congressional election is going to be held on November 6th. Right? There we go. November 6th, the Tuesday. The first Tuesday after the first Monday, as usual. So that means that even if you're going to be very pedantic and literal and draconian about the 60-day rule. Well, there's still another week, so let's recommend that this universe of those being investigated, that they should not give themselves over to hubris at this point. So that, in many ways, sets the stage. Now, we are detecting increased instability. It gets worse and worse. We've got reports, just a couple of brief notes. According to, in particular, Gabe Sherman of Vanity Fair, who has apparently some pretty good sources in and around the White House, his take on this in Vanity Fair is that Trump is going nuts, that he is obsessed by the notion that Don Jr. is now very much in the focus of the special prosecutor, that Don Jr. is being squeezed, and that there was an attempt to calm Trump down with a kind of group therapy. And this would have been carried out by his peers, I guess you could say, his cronies, in particular, people like this Tom Barrack, the guy who ran the inauguration. And there were tens of millions of dollars unaccounted for there. But that guy, Trump wanted him in the White House. He didn't want to come. That guy would have been part of it. And then the New York realtor, apparently once a competitor of Don, and that would be this guy Lefrak. Of course, in the world in which Koch becomes Coke, Lefrak, as in Lefrak City, in where? Queens, on Rego Park or Queens Boulevard? Anyway, Lefrak City, total living here today. See how little rent you pay back in the 60s. Anyway, Lefrak has become Lefrak. And these two and some others, right, some other sort of peers were supposed to come in and try to tell Trump, lay off the Twitters, do what the lawyers tell you to do, and so forth. But Trump rejected it out of hand. And the bright spot in Trump's life lately, according to Gabe in Vanity Fair, was stripping the security clearance from John Brennan, the former head of the CIA. That gave him a moment of joy, we're told. Well, we're also told that the word in the White House is that winter is coming. Now, this goes beyond meteorology. I think it has something to do with this Game of Thrones. So it means that hard times are at hand. Other articles, and we'll get into this, talk about a looming GOP hell, that the entire Republican Party descends into the underworld, right? Descensus Averno, down into the underworld they go, because they will be investigated 6 ways to Sunday by the Democrats, if the Democrats can get the majority in the House and take over some of these investigating committees, right? They will go to town, and we'll go through the list. And we have our own proposals, because we want economics and working people's issues reflected, not just Russiagate and Trumpgate, essential as those are. So we'll, I hope, set the stage with this tremendous instability, which is a threat to all of us. We'll be moving to the specifics when we come back here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, the growing psychological lability, this is by now a cliche, right? This is the headline every week, but it is. And you've got to frame everything else with that, because that is the structure of reality. This is what is going on, believe me. Part of it, again, is the threat, right? The closing of the ring. Closing the ring, wrote Churchill in his History of the Second World War. Well, that's in some ways where we are now. And you can see even some of the subsets, right? Manafort, now with the Patton indictments of today, the circle is closing around him. By the way, the Manafort trial, supposedly going to be on the 17th of September, will be delayed until the 24th of September. But now we've also got to see other causes for the instability, and specifically the elections, right? What's with these elections, right? Trump is now out on the road. He was out on the road yesterday in Indiana. He's out on the road somewhere else today, desperately flailing to try to get some Republicans elected to Congress. Now, the situation for Trump, I think, is grim. Let's just take a look at some polls. Now, we're going to the tabulation of Real Clear Politics, and you got to remember, look at all the polls. Just remember, when you're looking at the Rasmussen poll, this is not a poll. This is what, a push poll, a poll? I don't know, but it's not a normal poll. In terms of Trump's job approval, now this is publicly available. This came out today. ABC News, Washington Post, right? One of the half dozen biggest and most elaborate polls. The grim news for Trump is Trump has got 38% approval. 38% approval. The disapproval, 60%, meaning that Trump is 22 points underwater. Now, this tends to be confirmed by a couple of others. Let's say Reuters Ipsos of Wednesday of this week. 40% there approve Trump, 57% disapprove of Trump. So that's a 17% deficit for Trump. USA Today Suffolk poll of that same Wednesday this week, similar, 40% approve, 56% disapprove. Now, the outlier, of course, is Rasmussen. They are telling you that Trump has 48% approval and that he's only underwater by 2%. They have it 48 to 50. I am convinced this is essentially an exercise in public relations rather than actual polling. So that is all very, very grim. In terms of the generic congressional ballot, let's take a look at some of those. The Economist gives the Democrats +6. Rasmussen has to give the Democrats +5. Reuters Ipsos gives the Democrats +13. Harvard Harris poll, Democrats +8, all from this week, and so on down the line. I would also want to point out that some of these key Senate races upon which so much depends, these states supposedly where Trump won, and now the Democratic Senate incumbents who are fighting for re-election, they are supposed to become stooges and running dogs for Trump, and above all for Kavanaugh, the reactionary and indeed fascistoid judge for the Supreme Court, the theoretician of the unitary executive, which frankly means dictatorship, union busting, no right to vote, deregulation, pollution, all this stuff. Well, let's take a look at a couple of these. Oh, in Pennsylvania, we had Trump on the road trying to help Lou Barletta, the congressman. Well, the poll right now from Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania Senator Casey, 47%, Barletta, 34%. Casey leads by 13 points, and it looks similar for governor in that state. And if we look, we find that, for example, in Wisconsin, just one of those typical states, right, that Trump won by a tiny margin, but this is now part of the 10 where the Democrats are supposed to be weakened. Nothing necessarily like that. In reality, let's just see here if we can get these numbers called up. Tammy Baldwin, the current senator from there, is doing reasonably well compared to her reactionary Republican challenger. And let's see. Let's skip first to the Senate in Connecticut. Right, this should be in the bag. This is Senator Murphy over Republican challenger Corey, 54-37. So Murphy is leading by 17 points. And let's see what else we can find. Here we go with finally Tammy Baldwin. Tammy Baldwin is leading her reactionary Republican challenger Vukmir 50-42. So she's up by 8 points. In the Senate. Now, this is a real interesting one. Remember, there are possibilities of the Democrats actually picking up seats, right? We talked about Tennessee with the widely popular, well-known Bredesen, former governor of the state. Don't look now. Texas. The latest Emerson poll shows the religious hypocrite Ted Cruz, 39%, and his challenger, Beto O'Rourke, depending on any way you like it, just vote for the guy, 39-38. So Cruz is leading by 1, meaning he's leading by nothing. That's in the margin of poll. And we will be back here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and we're inviting you, as always, keep up with this commentary and these marching orders every day of the week from Monday through Thursday. And to do that, you go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and you sign up in just a minute, and after that, voila, you're going to get a solid hour of very relevant commentary and news, things that others don't have, and those days, right? And this is the prerequisite to keep up with these battles, right? We've now got about 2 months before this decisive midterm election. Some have said, what other elections are comparable to this one in terms of importance? Well, probably the most important election that we've ever had was October-November in those days, 1864, with Lincoln against McClellan, the Copperhead Democrat. So this was a question, with victory in sight, are you going to prosecute the Civil War to a victorious end, or are you going to do a rotten compromise that would leave a secessionist and slave-holding Confederacy holding half or more of the North American, or at least of the American part of the North American continent? And that was won decisively by Lincoln. The other one, of course, I would say, the 1940 election that Franklin D. Roosevelt had to defeat Lindbergh and the so-called America First pro-Nazi forces, who would have carried out appeasement, and then eventually they would have been overtaken by the overwhelming might of the entire Eurasian landmass under Hitler's auspices, and that was, of course, that's where we get this America First, right? America First was essentially a treasonous movement designed to acquiesce in world domination by a National Socialist and Italian fascist and Japanese militarist kind of an international. Right? We got problems like this now today. So www.americansystem.tv. Take a look. Go and just look at the headlines. And they keep you up to date. And, of course, then listen into the entire thing. And you can go back and listen to whatever you want. Now, it is assumed that Trump is getting to see private polling, confidential, secret, private polling coming from some of these Republican campaigns. And that as these results that we've just summarized for you suggest, the condition of the Republicans is very bad. We've got another poll I should have mentioned that shows Senator Mnuchin of West Virginia, I think reasonably ahead of his challenger. And, of course, we have some of these things are hopeless for the Republicans. Corey Stewart, the white supremacist, essentially neo-fascist candidate for Senate in the state of Virginia, way behind Senator Kaine, who was, of course, the running mate, the vice presidential candidate of Hillary Clinton. So Trump sees all this. He can see the handwriting on the wall, right? Mene tekel. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, and you can't change a word of it once that goes on. So it's grim. Now, the instability, then also the threat of these prosecutions. We've got other things, too, we'll talk about. But let's see some of the real political mistakes. I mean, real self-destructive blunders. I think probably one of the most dramatic is this idea that there was a 2% approximately increase in the pay scale of federal workers. 2%? Well, yesterday, Trump decided to cancel that. A little bit more than 2%, I think. And, that is going to lose them. I think we can calculate there are probably 1, 2, 3 seats that are gone. 2.1% across the board pay raise for federal workers. It was going to start in January. There was also a yearly adjustment of paychecks based on inflation and expenses in various regions, the so-called locality pay increase. That would have cost the federal government about $25 billion. This is now, 2.5 million federal workers, civilians. This is not the military. So Trump says, I have determined that for 2019, both across-the-board pay increases and locality pay increases will be set at 0. You have determined. Don't make me laugh, as one might say, right, on the streets of Queens back in the 1950s, to make myself understood. And this is in the middle. It goes together with two things. The first argument, of course, is we've just had the Republican tax scam lowering the corporate income tax rate from 35 to 22, 23%. And then, of course, the individual tax rates for fat cats, predators, parasites, hyenas, zombie bankers, and so forth, all of that cut. So, yeah, you're going to have $1 trillion deficit. You saw that coming. If you didn't want that, why did you go for this tax scheme? So that's one thing. But the other thing is the rhetoric of the regime is now, this is the greatest economic boom in history. You never had it so good. We're rolling in dough. Happy days are here again. That's the mantra of Trump out on the hustings, right, for the election, because he's now he's moving into campaign mode, right? Maybe not completely. Well, if that's so, if prosperity is upon us, why can't we have a 2% pay increase for federal workers and then some of these locality adjustments? No, says Trump. We can still attract federal workers. We can still recruit, retain, and reward high-performing federal employees and the ones with top skill sets. So this is absolute double talk. Now, the interesting thing is retribution at the polls. Probably the most federal workers are in California. We've got to hope that some of these federal workers are out there in the districts of people like Devin Nunes, the one that Congressman Issa is now leaving. How about Congressman McCarthy, who wants to be the Speaker of the House? Yes, Virginia, there is retribution, we may say again. Now, Virginia, coming after California, but the concentration of federal workers in Northern Virginia is very, very strong. It's overwhelming. And we'll tell you more when we come right back here on the World Crisis Radio. So we're just going through the blowback from Trump's obviously deranged, misguided, unstable, labile decision to block this token 2.1% pay increase for federal workers. And again, out in California, that means one thing. That's where most federal workers are. But then after that come Virginia, the district, and then, of course, Maryland. But right now, the races we want to look at, Barbara Comstock in Northern Virginia, one of the most odious hypocrites in the Republican stable. She has gotten into this place by God knows what tortured maneuvers, but it looks like, I would guess right now, there's a good chance that this is the end of the road. She has a capable opponent. She has been usurping that seat. She's out of touch, out of step with her district, and she's now going to be out there attempting to straddle, right, her adulation for Trump, and then on the other side, her attempt to portray herself as caring about the interests of her district. The district, before the announcement, was already leaning Democratic. In other words, Congresswoman Comstock was in trouble. And now she's got the Comstock load of trouble, I would say. There's another congressman in the Virginia suburbs. This is Scott Taylor. Scott Taylor put out a communique saying, I've got 30,000 federal workers in my district. I've got to do something about it. This may reach down into another part of Virginia, a little bit further south. I guess this is a little bit west of Richmond, I think. This is Dave Bratt. You'll remember Dave Bratt. He was, of course, one of the harbingers of the fake populist upheaval. This was his win in 2014 was assisted by Laura Ingraham and Mark Levin. So Bratt is already also in trouble. He's running against Abigail Spanberger. The Republicans are so desperate to stop Abigail Spanberger, who is a former intelligence official, that they procured, through God knows what means, her security clearance and put that online, and they're continuing to put it out. Now, this is like Valerie Plame. This is similar to Valerie Plame. You're taking a CIA official and you're spewing out secret information. I'm amazed that there's not a flying squad of marshals, maybe, to go and shut these things down, right, when they occur, right? It looks like federal crimes can occur and nothing happens, right? This is undermining the public faith in the rule of law. So that's I think, a very, very serious mistake, right? Worse than a crime, it's a mistake. Now, the other one is Trump predicting violence, and we'll have to contemplate this over some extent of time, and that is Trump saying that if his party, the Republicans, don't win the November elections, that then there's going to be violence. Now, he seems to attribute the violence to the Democratic opposition, and he talks a lot about Antifa, and that's what it's not the other way, but Antifa, because this was tested out in Germany, and of course it means Antifaschisten, supposedly. These are, of course, anarchists and hooligans who use political causes to get themselves some shred of credibility, but they're just really interested in the street fighting part. So we hold no brief for them. But Trump now says that violence may ensue. I'm trying to get you the exact quote. Got to remember with Trump, during the elections, he, in a sense, fomented, encouraged, incited violence in his rallies, but then this goes beyond it. This is now going to be political violence, and on a larger scale is what he seems to be talking about. Just remember that you can be a conservative, but then beyond that, you're going to be a reactionary, right? If you keep going to the right and you keep going in the wrong direction on most issues, what's the difference between a reactionary and a fascist? Well, it's, I think, largely that the fascist relies increasingly on extra-legal violence, right? Armed gangs. So whenever you get into this area of a government threatening violence and sort of making it clear that this is not the legal functioning of the state, but rather something else, then you're in very, very dangerous territory. During his campaign, Trump had said that Second Amendment people, this refers, of course, to the right to bear arms, which has now been absolutized and fetishized by the Republicans and the NRA, with the help of people like Butina, I'm sure. But that if you go into this area of violence, you've then crossed this line of demarcation. Now, this is above all interesting. Trump is giving the warning at a White House dinner Monday evening, attended by dozens of conservative Christian pastors. Now, these people are not conservative. They're right-wing radicals, right? They're right-wing extremists, ministers and supporters of his administration. So Trump is always trying to hype the turnout, right? He wants you to go and vote his way. Trump was stressing the stakes in November when he warned that if Democrats win, they will overturn everything that we've done, and they'll do it quickly and violently. And he says that mainly Antifa are violent people. Asked on Wednesday, what did you mean by that? Trump said, I just hope there won't be violence. If you look at what happens, there's a lot of unnecessary violence all over the world, but also in this country, and I don't want to see it. I just ask you, he says to the Elmer Gantrys, I just ask you to go out and make sure all your people vote, because if they don't, on November 6th, if they don't vote, then we're going to have a miserable 2 years, and we're going to have, frankly, a very hard period of time, because then it just gets to be one election you're just one election away from losing everything you've got, meaning the power usurped by the Republican Party with the help of foreign intervention, right? The Russian party, the party of betrayal. One pastor from Ohio is telling ABC News it was not a dire warning, except that things that we've been working on as a body of voters will be reversed and overturned. There are some violent people, but it was not that we've got to worry about murder in the streets and chaos and anarchy, right? Just the vocabulary here indicates how what a dangerous terrain we're on. And I guess with that, we come to the end of our first hour here, and we'll therefore be back in just a minute for the second half of this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Second hour of World Crisis Radio. Here we are, the afternoon of Friday, August 31st, and it's about 2 months to this decisive election, up there with 1864 and, if you like, 1940 as critical moments. If you want to know what would have happened if Lindbergh had emerged during 1940 and taken the Republican nomination and the presidency, read that interesting book by Philip Roth, The Plot Against America, because that would have been the outcome. So here we are. Trump is attempting to keep the dog and pony show going, I think, to dwindling crowds. Some of the life has gone out of the booze. It was widely noted that on that fateful day of August 21st, that was Manafort conviction and Cohen guilty plea day, leaving Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator in this, the McDougal and Stormy Daniels operations, which are illegal, and it's not as simple as Dershowitz and others are trying to tell you. But on those days, you could see that Trump, his usual bombastic rage was somewhat muted, and I think he's tended to be a little bit muted. But now, of course, it's going to lead to desperate initiatives to try to save the day, and it won't work. Now, we want to start the most essential thing here at the beginning of our second hour. The Kavanaugh candidacy for the Supreme Court must be blocked. Kavanaugh must go the way of Judge Robert Bork, the judicial tool and defender and stooge of Nixon. And this was then under Reagan in the, 1987. There was an attempt to put Bork on the Supreme Court, and it was defeated in those days by Senator Edward Kennedy, who immediately went to the floor and denounced him with a kind of a Ciceronian Philippic. Well, we don't have that right now, but we think that I believe absolutely you could still stop this. And anybody who says it's time to surrender is a fool. And any Democrat who says, I want to go home on vacation to campaign, I'm sorry, that's not the way to campaign. Campaign from Washington with deeds rather than speeches or TV ads or whatever you think you're going to do. Why is Kavanaugh bad? Well, of course, there's the conspiratorial angle. He is the hand-picked choice of the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo, I guess it is the honcho there. And Leonard Leo, of course, is a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Parenthetically, we've seen this week Pope Francis getting some grief from the reactionary forces in the church. Well, right now it's Archbishop Vigano, the Vatican diplomat, the former papal nuncio, who called on Pope Francis to resign. Well, there are other reactionaries in there, and some of them are associated with the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, where you've got to be a titled feudal aristocrat to be one of the leaders. And, of course, until quite recently, until Francis changed this, the top prelate was this guy, Cardinal Burke, the friend of Salvini, and I think the friend of Bannon. So that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the tentacles of this thing inside the church. Sovereign Military Order of Malta was, for quite a while, one of their assets. We'll see what it looks like today. So Kavanaugh's the hand-picked one. Now, of course, he is a theoretician of what amounts to dictatorship. We call it the permanent austerity dictatorship. It's a world where you have no right to vote. You have no trade union rights. You don't have the Wagner Act. You don't even have Taft-Hartley. You have nothing but your eyes to cry with. This means driving down standards of living. It means Chinese or Russian or Sino-Russian world domination, of course, because the U.S. model demands a high standard of living and high capital intensity, high capital investment per job, and therefore high wages. And with these guys, they're thinking of a kind of Confederate low-wage economy. Kavanaugh's a harbinger of that. So no unions, no real right to vote. Right now, we've still got the chance to correct things in North Carolina. Lower federal courts have now overturned once again the reactionary Republican attempt to gerrymander the minority vote, the black vote, Hispanic vote, out of existence in North Carolina. But if we get Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court by the end of September, which is the goal of Mitch, then by the time that case gets there, it may already be too late, right? There'll be a theoretician of disenfranchisement presiding. So deregulation, of course, and all the institutional things that essentially spell the end of freedom. I was amazed, but not surprised, to see Rand Paul. I was surprised he said so in public. Rand Paul was asked, do you support Kavanaugh? This is the great libertarian. And he said, yes, I do. Of course, Kavanaugh, the opposite of libertarian. He is essentially a unitary executive man. Like you call him a Unitarian, but that's already taken. And it means a dictatorship. It means all power in the presidency, and most relevant right now, he says that you can't indict the president while he's in office. Now, this week, we had a chance to review the important cases here, and what we found was that, going back to Watergate, in Watergate, the Watergate grand jury, under the leadership of jury foreman Vladimir Pregel, they attempted repeatedly to indict Nixon. They all voted in favor of indicting Nixon. Some of them raised both hands during the straw poll. But they were blocked by Jaworski, who was obviously told by LBJ or people like this, or his successors, right? He was gone by this point, but that's the school from which this guy Jaworski came. So Jaworski was good up to a point, but when it came to this critical point of swiftly indicting Nixon, right, before he could be pardoned, that would have made the point. Then you can't stop the pardon. Then, in Iran-Contra, Lawrence Walsh, my fellow alumnus of Flushing High School, one of our most distinguished graduates, Lawrence Walsh wanted to indict Reagan and Bush the Elder for their role in Iran-Contra drug running, gun running, financial crimes, wire fraud, all this other stuff. And this was blocked because Reagan was able to convince them that he was already senile. He already had galloping Alzheimer's, or as I saw it in near the Mayo Clinic one day, water on the brain, because he was there for that operation, maybe not widely reported. And then Bush, this is Bush the Elder, for having obstructed justice by failing to produce his diary. And Bush simply ignored the subpoenas, and Walsh could not enforce it. And then we'll give you the third one, but it's obviously the case that whether the president can be indicted or not is going to be a very big issue. And here's this flawed, wretched candidate saying, no, he can't be. That's Kavanaugh. So stop Kavanaugh. He goes the way of Bork. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're just going through the many, many reasons, a quick summary of why Kavanaugh has to be stopped, why he must be borked. And all that means is exposed for what he is. The Republicans are trying very hard to withhold the vast majority of the relevant documents. They've got a Republican wheelhorse who's doing the screening. This is outrageous. Anything scandalous, you can be sure they'll try to find a way to make it disappear or come out when it's too late. So he believes in the unitary executive. He believes that Trump is above the law. That's what he's going to be doing on the bench. In the American Enterprise Institute speech, it's clear that Kavanaugh supports the Rehnquist vote against Roe versus Wade. There's no right of privacy, therefore abortion is totally illegal, and that is simply a recipe for chaos, and again for dictatorial measures, a police state to enforce that. That's Roe versus Wade, and then of course Casey versus Planned Parenthood comes into play. He is obviously hostile to the Affordable Care Act, to Obamacare. He's against that. He's in favor of all kinds of deregulation. He is a tool of powerful Wall Street and corporate interests. He believes in the mission of Pruitt to strip all the environmental regulations. And, of course, when it comes down to clean water, clean air, that is extremely dangerous. And his positions go on from there. He always sides with the powerful corporate interests against ordinary people. So this guy is made to order for the unitary executive, and he's also a pornographer. If you remember the Starr investigation of Clinton, if you look at the key words Monica Lewinsky and cigar, you will get the reflection of this Kavanaugh's handiwork. Vast sections of this report are given over to pornographic questioning of Clinton. From a legal point of view, absolutely irrelevant, but somehow it went through, and he's responsible for that kind of stuff. Now, we're going to be focusing on Kavanaugh next week, but right now it's enough to say, get yourself ready, get your social media accounts ready, get ready to do things, right? There may be demonstrations. We'll be looking for those. If you find them, let us know. But now we were talking about the indictments, right? The main issue, the overriding one, is can Trump be indicted? The answer is yes. And we've got all kinds of people, anybody who was in the Watergate investigation, like Jill Wine-Banks, will tell you this. But we were telling you in the course of the week on the American system that, and we just summed up two parts of it here. One was the Watergate grand jury tried repeatedly to indict Nixon for a whole list of things. Jaworski frustrated them. He actually lied. He said, well, you'll have another chance once he's out of office. You can then absolutely go on and indict him. but then he never came back to them, and then it was soon too late because of the pardon. The second one was Lawrence Walsh. He wanted to indict Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush for Iran-Contra crimes, violating the Bolin Act and all sorts of other things. Reagan he convinced them that he was senile, demented, Alzheimer's, and then Bush simply refused to answer, and we ought to look into that. How did that go down? Ronald Rotunda of the staff of Kenneth Starr wrote this very interesting essay saying, look, the president can be indicted. If the framers of the Constitution had wanted to make the president immune to indictment, they could have said so. They did not say so. And, of course, for others, they did say so. For the Congress, they said that the Congress has immunity under the speech and debate clause, that in the Congress you can say pretty much anything and you cannot be called to account anywhere else. You cannot be hauled into any other court. You can be censured, or God knows, you could be expelled, I suppose, from the Congress. But nowhere else, no court has any jurisdiction over that. So that's an immunity. And then, if you remember the Congress, you have the privilege from arrest. On your way to Washington, while you're in Washington, and when you're coming back, you cannot be arrested. So those are two immunities that the Congress is given. So the reasoning then is, if the framers of the Constitution had wanted to give the president immunity from arrest, they would have put it in, saying president cannot be indicted, arrested, but he can be impeached. And here's how it works. Now, concerning related issues, we have, first of all, these prosecutions going on. Let's take a look at these. The legal actions against the current regime, and we won't try to count these right now, but here's the way it's going. On the level of federal criminal prosecutions, we have the Eastern District of Virginia, where Manafort was put on trial and convicted, and he may be headed towards a retrial, all the more so because it turns out that only one stubborn holdout claimed to have a reasonable doubt and would not vote for 10 of the 18 counts. On the other 8 counts, this person was forced to acquiesce. So Eastern District of Virginia, Manafort convicted, and it may go back there for a retrial. In the District of Columbia, you've got various things going on. It looks like this Patton indictment of today is going on there. There's also work being done, I think, on Butina and people like this at Maine Justice. And then you've got the very large operations of the Southern District of New York in Lower Manhattan. This involves the questions of Cohen and Weisselberg and others. So that's the federal criminal complex. They've also got Tucker and welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're just going through the fact that the Trump campaign and the Trump cartel, the Trump political faction, are under federal illegal attack in the Eastern District of Virginia, in the District of Columbia, from Maine Justice, the headquarters of the Department of Justice, and by the Southern District of New York. And the Southern District involves people like Cohen, involves Weisselberg, and the newly infamous Pecker of this chain of tabloids and so forth, and his safes, right? Much depends now on what's in his safes. Apparently he might have had 2 safes, one in New York, one in Los Angeles. Other safes, he had another one in Florida. That material would seem to be in the hands of federal prosecutors at this time. So that's the federal front. Then we have the New York State front. We have the New York County, Manhattan, District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, who is preparing a criminal investigation of Trump on the misdeeds, the illegalities committed by the Trump Organization and other Trump operations. You've also got Underwood, the New York Attorney General, right, the one who replaced the guy who was forced out for Me Too violations. She's now looking at the taxes, the tax returns of the various Trump entities. So that's those would also be criminal. Now, on the civil front, you've got New York State already suing the Trump Foundation. You've got the Attorneys General of Maryland and D.C. suing Trump, basically, the Trump White House on the Emoluments Clause. You've got a parallel civil action by Crew, including Norm Eisen and others, and Painter, and that's also against the White House. There are, I think, a couple of people in Congress who are suing Trump for some related things. Of course, you've got Stormy Daniels, assisted by Avenatti, who is suing Trump, as well as Cohen. You've got Summer Zervos suing for various wrongs that she says she suffered. So we have 4 different federal criminal theaters of action. You've got 2 New York State criminal theaters, and at least 6 different civil actions. I'm sure there are more civil actions. And then, coming up on December 4th, we have the trial of this character, Jeffrey Epstein, who is, to just look him up, he's accused of moral turpitude. He has spent time in jail for some of these things. He has been linked not only to Trump, but to others, right, to Bill Clinton and others. So the public has a right to know. This will be a civil trial in Palm Beach in a state court, Florida, starting December 4th, unless a last-ditch mediation heads this off. So that is quite a series of fronts. Now, we also want to point out the question of what they call the GOP hell. That is normal oversight. That's all it means. The normal oversight of the legislative branch over the executive. Now, Axios got a hold of a Republican list of what they think the Democrats are going to go after. Let's just try to get through this. President Trump's tax returns, President Trump's family businesses, Trump's dealings with Russia, payment to Stormy Daniels, firing of Comey, Trump's firing of U.S. attorneys, Preet Bharara, and so forth, the ban on transgender soldiers, Mnuchin's business dealings, White House staff personal email use. That's an interesting one. Turnabout is fair play, I guess. Cabinet Secretary travel. This would be Pruitt, Carson, many others. Office expenses, decorations, and so forth. Discussing classified information in a public restaurant or semi-public in Mar-a-Lago. Jared Kushner's ethic laws compliance. Dismissal of members of the EPA, that is, scientific representatives on various boards. The Muslim travel ban. Family separation policy. Hurricane response in Puerto Rico, 3,000 dead. Election security and hacking attempts. White House security clearances. Right? All kinds of people. Now, we would say all of these should be done, but you've also got to make sure that it's not just these sort of politically charged themes about Russiagate and other kinds of sort of insider points. We would like to suggest a series of other points, right? things that you want to have investigated that are of interest to working people, class-based investigations. How about what damage has been done to Obamacare? This involves Health and Human Services. It involves this awful woman, Seema Verma, at the Medicare and Medicaid centers. So with all this stuff, right, Trump boasts that he's destroying Obamacare, the individual mandate and so forth that he's been attacking. Well, how much damage has been done? How much damage has been done to farmers by the ill-advised, unprepared, and go-it-alone approach to tariffs? What about to consumers, especially financial product consumers? The Consumer Finance Protection Board, largely crippled by Mulvaney. What about the question of the general oversight of the stock market and things like that, not just from the consumer point of view, but from the overall? What has been the behavior of bank profits, the hedge fund profits, and so forth? Who gets Federal Reserve credit? Why isn't that more broadly available? Why is that hogged by zombie bankers and hedge fund hyenas? You get the idea. What's with any number of areas, right, that have to do with the welfare of working people. So not just Russiagate, not just this sort of insider process stuff, which is absolutely critical, and we're all for it. But you've got to then essentially go through these different points that we're just making. Now, Russia. Let's talk about Russia. We have limited time, but let's point out, for example, that right now it's late summer in the Mediterranean. Great time to head for the shore. But now what do you have? Russian naval forces, about 25 Russian warships, according to some, joined by Chinese warships. I can't confirm that, but some say joined by Chinese. So a Sino-Russian naval task force in the Mediterranean, right off the French Riviera, the Italian Riviera, the Greek islands, all the rest of it, they're there. This, of course, goes together with the 300,000 troops being deployed in the Russian Far East. That is going to be 1,000 tanks, almost 1,000 aircraft, and this time they claim the Chinese and the Mongolians are taking part. So it's a very threatening military profile, and what they drill is not defense. They drill attack. We'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis. Our final segment here on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, there is a drama going on in economics and finance. Trump claims that he made a deal with Mexico and that this is earth-shaking. And this afternoon, there are all kinds of reports about dealing with Canada. Is he willing to compromise? The Toronto paper, Toronto Star, says, no, he's not willing. He's quoted as saying that he's not giving any concessions. I think a lot of this is the dog and pony show that we mentioned at the beginning. However, this does increase the tension within the system. And, of course, the big news from Trump is he says he's willing to put tariffs on 200 products, or 200 billion in imports from China. We're also told, if we can believe this, that Ford Motor Company has decided that they won't build a plant in China, or they won't destine that plant for Ford Focus for the U.S. market. Now, again, a lot of this stuff is dubious because it's orchestrated, right? It's fake, rigged. So there's this, right? Trump also says that he may leave the World Trade Organization. Now, I think with this stuff we're getting to a level of demagogic desperation, the double D, demagogic desperation, that you seem to be losing your majority in the lower house and maybe the upper house too. Probably has reports. The lower house he could live with, but the upper house is where he's going to be removed So that's very, very serious business. So look for all kinds of bombastic posturing and manufactured crises. God knows. Twitter storms. Now, the other one is, in addition to the China tariff question, we've got the ongoing crisis of the Turkish lira, and this week we had the crisis of the Argentinian peso, which I think the interest rates there are now up to 60%. They were 45%. They were raised by 15% to try to keep the peso afloat. That's going to strangle the real economy, needless to say, but they're doing it. So right now things are kind of winding down here in the U.S. at least because of the Labor Day holiday, and we're all for labor. But, of course, the real Labor Day is May 1st. That's another story. And that comes from Chicago. That's not some foreign concoction. So Turkey, Argentina, the general panorama for the emerging markets looks bad. Now, the other question. We are entering the month of Munich. We're entering the 80th anniversary of the Munich appeasement sellout of 1938. And that is what set the stage for the beginning of the Second World War, less than a year later. And we've got stuff like that going on, right? We have Trump, of course, calling off the various military exercises in South Korea. Mattis saying that those are going to resume. And as I read it, Trump saying, no, they're not going to resume. So a full appeasement line coming from this White House. Very, very serious stuff. We then have this issue of the blinding of U.S. intelligence. Just to tick these off. If you look at people like Brennan, Strzok, Lisa Page, Bruce Orr, Stefan Halper, one way you can put this together is these are people who did things to investigate Trump, who have criticized Trump, clashed with Trump, and so forth. By harassing these people, getting them fired, stripping their security clearances, one of the effects of this, and it may be deliberate at somebody's level, is to begin blinding and crippling U.S. intelligence vis-a-vis Russian oligarchs and towards that special subset of Russian oligarchs who are the Russian mafia, right? With Brennan, it's clear Brennan was the one who put the FBI investigation into high gear. Remember, he was getting reports from Australia, Britain, Netherlands, France, Germany, Poland, Estonia. That's where it came from, not from the Steele dossier. In the case of Strzok, Strzok was a counterintelligence, counterespionage official, and he was the one who began rounding up the illegals, right, that partial sleeper cell, Anna Chapman, 2011. Lisa Page had worked with an FBI group in Budapest to attack various Russian oligarchs, in particular one guy, Firtash, who has come up over these months. Stefan Halper had a network, looks like, may have reached into Eastern Europe and Russia, and, that's now not working. And we had from the New York Times this week, right now, vital Kremlin informants have gone silent, leaving the CIA and other spy agencies in the dark about precisely what Putin is doing looking forward to November. And later on here, they say that they can't cite specific cases of actual agents saying, look, I'm dropping out. But what they do have is other countries, in other words, whole intelligence establishments. They essentially say that this is now leading to these countries not delivering the sorts of intelligence that they have, which the U.S. could certainly use. And the bottom line is that the fact that the Republicans in Congress insisted on outing this Stefan Halper, much in the way that the Republicans, right, whether it was Scooter Libby or the other guy, right, the one who eventually popped up, right, Armitage. It's going to have the effect of blinding various kinds of intelligence. Some allies have cited the exposure of the informant, Halper, and other intelligence leaks in curbing some of the intelligence they share. And long-term, this exposure will hurt overseas collection. Blowing your sources is bad for business, and it's crippling. So now we'll take a look. The big one this week was Bruce Orr. What's with Bruce Orr? Let's see if we can tell this story in the time that we have. Orr was grilled behind the scenes by the Nunes gang in the Congress, and what did we learn? Orr apparently told the congressman, according to AP, he learned from Steele in one of their meetings, they had about a dozen, was that an unnamed former Russian intelligence official said Russia believes they have Trump over a barrel, according to people who are leaking from this meeting. It was not clear from the interview whether Steele had been told directly or how he picked it up, but this broader sentiment is echoed in the Steele research dossier. Now, or one of the champions in fighting back against the license and the running wild of these Russian oligarchs. For example, in 2006, approximately, the lawyer for Mogilevich came to Orr and the FBI and said, we want to make a deal. Mogilevich wants to be able to travel freely in the U.S., and you drop all these charges. And Orr and the FBI guy said, no dice, give yourself up and go on trial. Then later, it was the turn of Deripaska, whose visa was taken away with the help of Orr. So one part of this list is these are people that have crossed Don. The other thing with this, the same list, people, including Brennan, who have crossed the Russian oligarchy and the included Russian mafia. So we're being blinded in the midst of the run-up to this critical election. And part of it is what's coming out of this White House. So we wish everybody a great Labor Day holiday. We'll be back on the American System on Tuesday. And have a nice time. But vigilant